On the morning of April 14, 1991, FBI Special Agent Michael Torres stood at the edge of a compound in rural New Mexico, watching through binoculars as children filed out of a large wooden structure for what appeared to be morning prayers. He'd been surveilling the property for 3 weeks as part of a multi-agency task force investigating reports of welfare fraud and possible child abuse. What caught his attention that morning wasn't the number of children, though there were many, over 60 by his count. It wasn't even the way they moved in perfect synchronized lines, though that was unusual enough. What made Torres lower his binoculars and radio for his supervisor was something he noticed when the early morning sun hit their faces at just the right angle. Every single child, from toddlers to teenagers, had the exact same eyes. Not similar, not close, identical. The same unusual pale green color with the same golden flecks near the pupil. The same slightly downturned shape at the outer corners. The same unnaturally intense, unblinking stare. Torres had worked cult cases before. He'd seen communities where everyone dressed alike, spoke alike, even carried themselves with the same rigid posture. But he'd never seen a group where the genetics had narrowed to the point that it showed in such an obvious, unmistakable way. When the FBI finally raided the compound 6 days later, what they discovered would become one of the most disturbing cases of systematic inbreeding and genetic manipulation in American law enforcement history. This is the story of the sanctuary of the Eternal Bloodline, of one man who married 80 women who were all sisters, and of what happens when religious ideology, absolute power, and a twisted understanding of genetics collide in the darkest possible way. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The man at the center of this nightmare was born Thomas Elijah Crowder in 1943 in a small town in Arkansas. He was the 7th son of a Pentecostal preacher who believed in signs, prophecies, and the literal interpretation of every word in the Bible. Thomas grew up in an environment where questioning religious authority was considered a sin worse than any crime, where physical discipline was seen as godly correction, and where women were taught from birth that their purpose was to serve, obey, and bear children. By the time Thomas was 25, he'd already started his own small congregation, breaking away from his father's church with claims of having received direct revelations from God. His preaching style was charismatic and intense. He spoke about purity, about bloodlines, about the importance of keeping the faithful separated from the corrupted world. He attracted followers who were looking for absolute answers, for someone who would tell them exactly how to live, what to think, what to believe. And among his earliest and most devoted followers was a family named Patterson, a family with 19 daughters. The Patterson family had moved to Arkansas from Louisiana in the 1950s, part of a fundamentalist Christian sect that practiced strict separation from modern society. They homeschooled their children, avoided hospitals and doctors, and believed that large families were a blessing from God. When Thomas Crowder began preaching at their church in 1968, the eldest Patterson daughter, Mary, was 23 years old. The youngest, Ruth, was just 4. Their father, Jacob Patterson, was immediately drawn to Crowder's teachings about purity and bloodlines, about the need to create communities of the truly faithful who would be ready for the end times. Within a year, Jacob had arranged for Mary to marry Thomas Crowder. Within 5 years, Thomas had married 7 more Patterson sisters. By 1980, he had married all 19 of them, plus dozens more women from other families within his growing congregation. But it was the Patterson sisters who formed the core of what Thomas called his foundation wives, the women whose bloodline he believed was specially chosen by God to produce the next generation of the faithful. Thomas Crowder's theology was built on a twisted interpretation of Old Testament patriarchs and a pseudoscientific understanding of genetics that he'd cobbled together from fringe books and his own imagination. He preached that genetic dilution was the root of all sin, that when the faithful married outsiders, they weakened not just their bloodlines, but their spiritual connection to God. He taught that certain families had been chosen by God to carry pure genetics, uncorrupted by the sins of the modern world, and that it was his divine mission to concentrate and purify these bloodlines through careful, controlled breeding. The Patterson family, he claimed, carried markers of this divine selection. Their unusual eye color, which ran through multiple generations, was proof of their genetic purity. By marrying all the sisters, by having children with each of them, he believed he was creating a new race of humans who would be spiritually and genetically superior to the rest of humanity. In 1975, Crowder purchased 340 acres of isolated land in northern New Mexico, far from highways and towns, accessible only by a single dirt road that wound through desert scrubland for miles. He called it the sanctuary of the Eternal Bloodline. Over the next 5 years, his followers built a compound that would house over 300 people at its peak. The main structure was a massive wooden building that served as church, dining hall, and communal living space. Surrounding it were smaller cabins where the wives lived with their children, arranged in a strict hierarchy based on which wife had produced the most children, and which children showed the traits that Crowder valued most. The entire compound was surrounded by a fence that Crowder claimed was to keep the corrupt world out, but that also served to keep his followers trapped inside. No one was permitted to leave without his explicit permission. No one was allowed to communicate with family members outside the compound. Children were taught from birth that the world beyond the fence was diseased, dying, and damned. By 1980, Crowder had fathered over 100 children. The Patterson sisters alone had given him 43, but he wasn't satisfied with simply having many children. He wanted to shape them, to breed them according to his vision of genetic perfection. As the first generation of children reached adolescence, Crowder began arranging marriages between them, always half siblings, always carefully selected to concentrate what he called the markers of election. He kept detailed records, charts that mapped out which children had inherited the distinctive green eyes, which ones showed other traits he'd decided were signs of genetic purity: unusual height, left-handedness, perfect pitch, even birthmarks in specific locations. Children who didn't display these markers were assigned to manual labor, forbidden from marrying, essentially designated as genetic failures within their own community. Those who showed the desired traits were groomed from childhood to understand that they would marry their half-siblings, that this was God's plan, that their children would be even more pure, even more chosen. The Patterson sisters, despite being co-wives sharing one husband, developed their own internal hierarchy and conflicts. Mary, the eldest, considered herself the primary wife and resented when Crowder showed favor to her younger sisters. Several of the middle sisters formed alliances, supporting each other in the brutal competition for Crowder's attention and approval. The youngest sisters, who'd been married to Crowder when they were still teenagers, seemed to exist in a state of permanent psychological trauma, going through the motions of their assigned roles but emotionally absent, their eyes vacant even as they performed their duties of cooking, cleaning, and bearing children. The few outsiders who visited the compound in the late 1970s and early 1980s, usually social workers conducting routine welfare checks that Crowder had been tipped off about in advance, noted that the women seemed fearful and submissive. But in those years before widespread awareness of cult dynamics, this was often dismissed as simply their religious culture, protected under freedom of religion. What none of those early visitors understood was the extent of control Crowder exercised over every aspect of life in the sanctuary. He controlled all food distribution, often using starvation as punishment for disobedience. He controlled all information, with no newspapers, television, or radio permitted except for his own sermons played on constant loop through speakers mounted around the compound. He controlled reproduction, deciding when couples would try to conceive and punishing wives who failed to become pregnant or who miscarried, which he interpreted as signs of spiritual weakness. Most importantly, he controlled the children's understanding of reality. From birth, they were taught that Thomas Crowder was not just their father but God's direct representative on earth, that his word was literally divine law, that questioning him was equivalent to questioning God. The children who grew up in the sanctuary in the 1970s and 1980s had no concept of normal family structures, no understanding that what was happening to them was abuse, no framework for recognizing that the isolation, the arranged marriages to siblings, the constant surveillance and punishment were anything other than how life was supposed to be. By 1985, the first generation of children born in the sanctuary were reaching marriageable age, and Crowder's breeding program entered its second phase. He began arranging marriages between half-siblings with an almost scientific precision, creating charts that showed which combinations would concentrate the genetic markers he valued. A son from Mary Patterson's line would marry a daughter from her sister Sarah's line. Their children would then be matched with the children of other, carefully selected pairings. The genetic math was brutal and simple. Every generation would be more closely related than the last, the gene pool shrinking with each birth, the distinctive features becoming more pronounced until everyone in the community would be immediately identifiable as part of the same bloodline. What Crowder didn't understand, or perhaps didn't care about, was that genetic markers don't exist in isolation. When you concentrate desired traits through inbreeding, you also concentrate undesired ones, including recessive genetic disorders that remain hidden until both parents carry the same damaged gene. The second generation of children, those born from sibling marriages in the mid to late 1980s, began showing problems that couldn't be explained away as spiritual tests. There was a dramatic increase in infant mortality, with nearly 1 in 4 children dying before their first birthday. Those who survived often had health issues, congenital heart defects, immune system disorders, mental delays. But perhaps most noticeably, they showed increasingly severe expression of the traits Crowder had been selecting for. The green eyes that had been distinctive in the Patterson sisters became almost alien in their grandchildren, larger and more prominent, with an intensity that made them look like they were staring through people rather than at them. Several children were born with a condition called coloboma, where part of the iris didn't form properly, creating a keyhole shape to the pupil that gave them an unsettling, inhuman appearance. Crowder interpreted these increasingly extreme expressions as proof that his breeding program was working, that they were becoming visibly different from corrupted humanity. The reality was that they were experiencing the genetic equivalent of an evolutionary bottleneck, where harmful recessive genes were being expressed at unprecedented rates. Life for children in the sanctuary during this period was regimented and psychologically brutal. They were woken at dawn for prayers, spent hours each day memorizing scriptures and Crowder's teachings, performed hard physical labor in the fields and workshops, and were subjected to constant surveillance and correction. Education beyond religious instruction was minimal and twisted to serve Crowder's ideology. They were taught that science was satanic, that doctors were agents of a corrupt system designed to weaken God's chosen people, that any health problems they experienced were tests of faith rather than genetic consequences of inbreeding. Children were encouraged to report on each other, creating an atmosphere of paranoia and mistrust. Physical punishment was routine and severe, with children beaten for infractions as minor as asking questions or making eye contact with the wrong person. Sexual abuse was woven into the fabric of the community, normalized through Crowder's teachings about marriage and reproduction, with girls as young as 12 being prepared for their eventual marriages to their half-brothers or even, in some cases, to Crowder himself, if he decided they carried particularly valuable genetic traits. The Patterson sisters, now in their 30s and 40s, occupied a strange position in the compound's hierarchy. They were both victims and enforcers, women who'd been groomed and controlled by Crowder for decades, but who also participated in grooming and controlling the next generation. Some seemed to have completely internalized his ideology, genuinely believing that the genetic nightmare unfolding around them was divine providence. Others showed signs of breaking under the psychological strain, becoming withdrawn or developing behaviors that suggested severe mental illness. At least 2 of the sisters died during this period under circumstances that were never adequately explained. Their bodies buried in the compound's cemetery without any official death certificates or investigations. The surviving sisters didn't question these deaths publicly, trained as they were to accept whatever Crowder declared as God's will. But some would later testify that they lived in constant fear, knowing that disagreeing with Crowder or failing to produce healthy children could result in being disappeared. By 1988, the compound's population had reached its peak of over 300 people. But the demographics were ominous. There were more elderly than children, more children dying than being born healthy, and a growing number of young people showing signs of the genetic damage that would only worsen with each successive generation. Crowder responded to these trends not by questioning his breeding program, but by intensifying it, arranging more marriages between close relatives, demanding that wives conceive more frequently, and becoming increasingly paranoid about outside interference. He began teaching that the government knew about the sanctuary's genetic purity and was plotting to destroy them out of jealousy, that any contact with outsiders could contaminate their bloodlines, that they needed to prepare for a siege. He started stockpiling weapons and conducting drills where members practiced hiding in underground bunkers he'd constructed beneath several of the compound's buildings. The sanctuary was transforming from a religious community into an armed fortress, and the children growing up within it were being prepared not for a future in the outside world, but for an apocalyptic confrontation that Crowder insisted was inevitable. The beginning of the end came from an unexpected source, a 12-year-old girl named Rebecca Crowder Patterson, granddaughter of Mary Patterson and Thomas Crowder, who managed to smuggle a letter out of the compound in 1989. The letter was hidden in a vegetable shipment that went to a grocery store in the nearest town, where it was discovered by a stock clerk who immediately contacted authorities. In simple, misspelled sentences, Rebecca described life in the sanctuary, the marriages between siblings, the children who died and were buried without doctors ever seeing them, the punishments, the isolation, the fear. She wrote that she'd been told she would marry her half-brother Nathan when she turned 13, that she didn't want to, that she was scared, that she didn't know if anyone outside the compound would help, but she had to try. The letter ended with a sentence that would haunt investigators. "We all have the same eyes, because we all have the same Addie, and I think that means something is wrong, but nobody here will say it." That letter triggered a 2 year investigation involving the FBI, New Mexico State Police, Child Protective Services, and multiple federal agencies. The challenge was that the sanctuary wasn't obviously breaking laws that were easy to prosecute. Polygamy was illegal, but the marriages weren't officially registered. So technically Crowder was only legally married to his first wife. The arranged marriages between minors were concerning, but they were also happening within a closed religious community that claimed First Amendment protections. Even the inbreeding, while morally and medically disturbing, wasn't explicitly illegal in New Mexico if the participants were consenting adults, which Crowder claimed they all were. Investigators knew children were being abused, but penetrating the compound to gather evidence proved nearly impossible. Crowder had informants in local government who warned him about planned visits, giving him time to stage scenes of normalcy. The few times social workers managed surprise inspections, they found children who'd been coached on what to say, wives who insisted everything was voluntary and religious, and no obvious signs of the abuse that investigators knew must be occurring. What finally gave investigators the leverage they needed was financial crimes. Crowder had been claiming welfare benefits for dozens of children, using false information about their paternity and his wife's marital status to qualify for aid he wasn't entitled to. He'd also been engaged in tax fraud, structuring the compound's finances to avoid paying taxes on income generated by selling produce and crafts made by compound members. In early 1991, federal prosecutors built a case for welfare fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy that gave them the legal justification to raid the compound and seize records. The raid was planned meticulously. Authorities knew they were dealing with an armed, paranoid community that had been preparing for exactly this scenario. They knew there were children inside who would be terrified and confused. They knew the compounds lay out from aerial surveillance, but had no clear intelligence about weapons caches or potential resistance. The raid was scheduled for April 20th, 1991, at dawn, when most of the compound would be gathered for morning prayers, minimizing the chance of people being scattered and armed throughout the property. Agent Michael Torres, who'd been watching the compound on and off for months, was part of the entry team. Years later, in sealed testimony that was finally released under Freedom of Information requests, he described the raid as one of the most psychologically disturbing experiences of his career, worse in some ways than violent confrontations he'd been involved in because the horror was so quiet, so normalized. When agents entered the main building, they found over 200 people gathered in the central hall, sitting in absolute silence, all of them staring at the doors with those identical green eyes. No one screamed or ran. No one resisted. They simply sat there watching as agents spread through the building. Torres wrote that it was like entering a space occupied by a single organism with multiple bodies, that the way everyone moved and reacted in synchronization felt fundamentally wrong, fundamentally inhuman. Children clung to adults who weren't their mothers but their aunts or grandmothers or half-sisters. The family relationships so tangled that it was impossible to determine who belonged to whom. Women held infants who had that same distinctive eye color, that same unsettling stare. Crowder himself was found in a private chamber behind the main hall, surrounded by his extensive records of the breeding program. Charts covered the walls, showing family trees that looped back on themselves in ways that made no biological sense, tracking traits across generations with color-coded markers. He'd documented every birth, every marriage, every genetic outcome with obsessive detail. When agents arrested him, he didn't resist or protest. He simply asked if he could finish his morning sermon first, as if being arrested by federal agents was a minor scheduling inconvenience. His calm was more disturbing than resistance would have been, a sign of how completely he'd dissociated from normal reality, how genuinely he believed that everything he'd done was righteous, and that God would vindicate him. As he was led out in handcuffs, he turned to his followers still sitting in that silent hall, and told them that this was the persecution he'd prophesied, that they should remain faithful, that he would return. And every single person in that hall nodded in synchronization, their identical eyes following him until he disappeared through the door. In the days following the raid, as investigators combed through the compound and interviewed residents, the full scope of the horror became apparent. The sanctuary wasn't just a cult that practiced polygamy and arranged marriages. It was a multi-generational genetic experiment that had produced a population unlike any other documented in modern America. Medical examinations of the children revealed that virtually all of them had health issues related to inbreeding, immune disorders, congenital defects, developmental delays. But what disturbed doctors most was the uniformity. Siblings looked more like identical twins. Cousins were indistinguishable from siblings. The genetic diversity that normally exists even within families had collapsed to the point where DNA testing showed that most of the children shared more genetic material with each other than typical full siblings would. They weren't just closely related. They were nearly genetically identical, as if the entire third generation of the sanctuary had been cloned from a very small number of templates. The psychological damage was even more extensive than the physical. Children as old as 15 had no concept of the world outside the compound, no understanding of normal family structures or social relationships. They couldn't comprehend that marrying their siblings was unusual or wrong, because it was the only model of marriage they'd ever known. They spoke in a dialect that mixed standard English with phrases and concepts unique to the sanctuary, making communication with therapists and social workers difficult. Many showed symptoms of complex PTSD, dissociating when asked about their experiences, or responding to questions with programmed answers clearly taught by Crowder. They had no individual identity separate from the collective. When asked their names, some would respond with their genetic classification from Crowder's breeding charts, rather than their given names. They'd been taught that their value as human beings was determined entirely by whether they carried the right genetic markers, and children who'd been classified as genetic failures showed profound self-hatred and depression that no amount of reassurance from caregivers could immediately overcome. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? If you'd been born into that compound, believing it was normal, and then suddenly the outside world came crashing in telling you everything you'd been taught was a lie. The Patterson sisters presented a particularly complex challenge. They were victims of Crowder's manipulation, most of them married to him when they were teenagers or even younger, groomed into accepting his twisted ideology. But they were also adults who'd participated in perpetuating the abuse, who'd helped arrange marriages between their own children, who'd enforced Crowder's rules. Prosecutors struggled with how to handle them. Were they accomplices or victims? The answer, unsatisfyingly, was both. Some of the sisters, particularly the older ones, were charged with child endangerment and welfare fraud. Others were deemed too psychologically damaged to stand trial, their ability to distinguish right from wrong so thoroughly destroyed by decades of abuse and indoctrination that they couldn't be held fully responsible for their actions. Mary Patterson, the eldest sister and Crowder's first wife, insisted throughout her interviews that Thomas had been doing God's work, that the genetic program was blessed, that investigators didn't understand the divine purpose behind what looked like suffering. She showed no remorse, no recognition that her own children and grandchildren had been damaged by her complicity. She was ultimately deemed mentally incompetent and placed in a psychiatric facility, where she remained until her death in 2003, still insisting that Thomas Crowder was a prophet. The underground bunkers that Crowder had constructed revealed another layer of horror. In one, investigators found medical supplies and crude surgical equipment, evidence that Crowder had been performing medical procedures on compound members without any training or qualifications. There were records of forced sterilizations performed on women and girls who'd been deemed genetically unfit to reproduce. There were descriptions of births that had gone wrong, of infants with severe deformities who'd been allowed to die without medical intervention because Crowder had declared them tests of faith. In another bunker, they found a nursery of sorts, but not for living children. It was a repository of preserved remains, fetuses, and infants who'd died or been stillborn, kept in jars of formaldehyde like specimens in a laboratory. Crowder had been documenting every genetic outcome, even the failures, as if he was conducting a scientific experiment rather than destroying real human lives. The discovery of these remains, over 30 in total, led to additional charges of abuse of a corpse and improper disposal of human remains. Perhaps most disturbing were the journals found in Crowder's private chambers, thousands of pages documenting his thoughts and plans over decades. They revealed a progression from religious delusion to something darker and more calculated. In early entries from the 1970s, he genuinely seemed to believe he was following divine guidance. But by the 1980s, the journals showed an awareness that what he was doing was harmful, acknowledgement that the children were suffering, recognition that the genetic damage was worsening. He continued anyway, driven not by faith, but by a narcissistic need to prove his theories correct, to create something that would outlast him, to be remembered as the man who created a new type of human, even if that creation was monstrous. In one chilling entry from 1989, he wrote about Rebecca, the girl who'd smuggled out the letter, noting that she was becoming rebellious and questioning, that she might need to be married earlier than planned or else isolated to prevent her from contaminating others with doubt. The casual way he discussed destroying a child's life to protect his ideology revealed the depth of his moral bankruptcy. Thomas Elijah Crowder's trial began in January 1993 and lasted 4 months, becoming a media sensation that forced America to confront uncomfortable questions about religious freedom, government intervention, and how such abuse could continue for decades undetected. Crowder faced 87 counts including welfare fraud, tax evasion, child abuse, sexual abuse of minors, unlawful restraint, and conspiracy. His defense team argued that he was being persecuted for his religious beliefs, that the marriages and breeding program were protected under the First Amendment, that the government had no right to impose its values on a closed religious community. The prosecution countered with medical evidence of the harm caused by systematic inbreeding, with testimony from children describing abuse and coercion, with financial records showing calculated fraud, with those preserved remains found in the bunkers as physical evidence of children who died because Crowder refused them medical care. The jury saw those charts from his walls, the breeding records that reduced human beings to genetic date points, and heard audio recordings of his sermons where he described children born with defects as acceptable losses in the pursuit of genetic purity. The trial revealed details that shocked even hardened prosecutors. Multiple women testified that Crowder had fathered children with his own daughters and granddaughters, creating genetic relationships so complex that DNA analysts had difficulty mapping them. One woman, identified in court only as Patterson Subject 17 to protect her identity, testified that she was simultaneously Crowder's daughter, wife, and the mother of his children, and that this arrangement had been presented to her as a spiritual honor rather than incest and abuse. She described being married to him at age 13, giving birth to her first child at 14, and being told that any reluctance she felt was evidence of spiritual weakness that needed to be beaten out of her. Her testimony, delivered in a flat, emotionless tone that suggested severe dissociation, was so disturbing that several jurors were seen crying. The defense's attempts to discredit her by suggesting she was a willing participant backfired spectacularly when medical experts explained that children who are groomed and abused from birth cannot meaningfully consent to anything, that her emotional flatness was a symptom of severe trauma, not evidence of voluntary participation. In April 1993, Thomas Crowder was found guilty on 79 of 87 counts. He was sentenced to 45 years in federal prison, effectively a life sentence given that he was 50 years old at the time. He showed no emotion at sentencing, no remorse, no acknowledgement of harm caused. When given the opportunity to make a statement, he used it to condemn the jury, the judge, and the government, insisting that history would vindicate him, that he'd been trying to save humanity from genetic degradation, that in 100 years, people would understand he'd been a visionary, persecuted by a corrupt system. The judge responded by adding additional years to his sentence, noting that Crowder's complete lack of remorse demonstrated he would remain a danger to society if ever released. Crowder died in prison in 2011 at age 68, having never admitted wrongdoing, having never apologized to the hundreds of people whose lives he'd destroyed. His death was barely noted in the media. By then, the sanctuary of the Eternal Bloodline had faded from public consciousness, remembered primarily as a footnote in the history of American cults. The aftermath for the survivors was complex and ongoing. The over 200 people removed from the compound had to be integrated into a world they'd been taught to fear and reject. Children were placed in foster care or group homes, but most struggled terribly with the transition. They had nightmares about the compound, but they also felt homesick for it, the only home they'd ever known. They had severe attachment issues, unable to bond with caregivers or trust adults after a lifetime of manipulation and abuse. Many required extensive medical treatment for the genetic conditions caused by inbreeding, treatments that continued throughout their lives. Educational integration was nearly impossible for the older children. They were years behind their peers academically, and their socialization was so different that they couldn't relate to other children their age. Some eventually managed to build relatively normal lives, but they carried the visible markers of their origin, those distinctive green eyes that marked them as survivors of the sanctuary, that prompted questions they often couldn't bear to answer. The Patterson sisters who survived faced their own challenges. Most were institutionalized, at least temporarily, for psychiatric treatment. Several attempted suicide in the years following the compound's dissolution, unable to cope with the guilt of their complicity or the loss of the only identity they'd ever had. A few of the younger sisters, who'd been barely more than children themselves when married to Crowder, eventually recovered enough to build independent lives, though they changed their names and moved far from New Mexico to escape their past. Others never left institutional care, too damaged by decades of abuse and the trauma of having their entire world destroyed. In interviews conducted years later by researchers studying cult recovery, several sisters expressed confusion about whether they should feel like victims or perpetrators, whether they deserved sympathy or condemnation. The answer, like so much about the sanctuary, was complicated and uncomfortable, refusing to fit into neat categories of guilt and innocence. The compound itself was demolished in 1995. The buildings burned, and the land sold to a ranching company that wanted no association with its history. The cemetery where sanctuary members had been buried was relocated. The bodies exhumed and reinterred in a county cemetery under a single marker that reads simply "The Forgotten," with no names or dates. The New Mexico state government wanted to erase all physical evidence of what had happened there, as if removing the buildings could somehow remove the stain from the state's history. But you can't erase the impact of what occurred at the sanctuary of the Eternal Bloodline, and you can't erase the people who survived it. As of 2024, dozens of Crowder's children and grandchildren are still alive, living with the consequences of his genetic experiment. Many have serious health problems related to their inbreeding. Many struggle with psychological issues, and all of them carry those distinctive eyes, the visible marker of what was done to them. The case raised questions that America still hasn't fully answered. At what point should the government intervene in religious communities, even ones that claim First Amendment protections? How do we balance religious freedom with child protection when children are being raised in isolated environments where they have no ability to seek help? The sanctuary existed for over 20 years, in a country with social services and law enforcement, with neighbors who knew something strange was happening at that compound. Yet it took a 12-year-old girl risking everything to smuggle out a letter before authorities took serious action. How many other isolated communities exist right now, practicing beliefs and behaviors that harm children, protected by our cultural reluctance to interfere with religion? These aren't comfortable questions and they don't have easy answers, but the survivors of the sanctuary deserve for us to at least ask them. The genetic impact of Crowder's breeding program will echo through generations. The children of the sanctuary who have gone on to have their own children, with partners from outside the compound, carry recessive genetic disorders that can be passed on. Medical geneticists who have studied the sanctuary survivors say it may take 3 or 4 generations of outbreeding before the genetic damage is sufficiently diluted. Some survivors have chosen not to have children, afraid of passing on the disorders they carry, afraid of creating another generation marked by their grandfather's twisted legacy. Others have had children and live with constant anxiety about their health, waiting for genetic issues to manifest. The sanctuary may be gone, but its impact on human genetics is permanent, a scar written into DNA that will persist long after the last person who remembers Thomas Crowder is dead. There's a deeper question that the sanctuary forces us to confront. What does it mean to be human? And at what point does isolation and genetic manipulation create something that exists at the edge of humanity? The third-generation children of the sanctuary, those born in the late 1980s and early 1990s, were so genetically similar and so psychologically shaped by their environment that they functioned almost as a hive mind, responding to stimuli in synchronization, communicating in ways that seemed to bypass normal language. Anthropologists and psychologists who studied them described them as having developed their own micro-culture so divergent from mainstream human society that it raised philosophical questions about cultural relativism and human nature. Were they a separate culture that deserved respect and preservation? Or were they victims of abuse who needed to be rescued and assimilated? The answer should be obvious. Abuse is abuse regardless of cultural context. But the sanctuary's existence challenged our assumptions about how much human psychology, and even biology, can be shaped by environment and ideology. The story of the sanctuary of the Eternal Bloodline should haunt us because it reveals how quickly humans can slide into creating systems of systematic abuse when given absolute power, how easily religion can be twisted to justify atrocities, and how willing we are as a society to ignore suffering when it occurs in communities we label as other or different. Thomas Crowder wasn't a supernatural monster. He was a man shaped by the fundamentalist culture he was raised in, who took common beliefs about purity and bloodlines and hierarchy and pushed them to their logical extreme. His followers weren't stupid or weak. They were people looking for meaning and community who got trapped in a system that exploited their faith, and isolated them until escape became psychologically impossible. The children born in the sanctuary had no choice, no agency, no ability to consent to the genetic and psychological experiment they were part of. They are living reminders that the most horrific abuses often happen not in sudden bursts of violence, but in slow, methodical systems built over decades, normalized and sanctified until the people trapped inside them can no longer see how wrong they are. If this story has disturbed you, if it's made you think about intervention and responsibility, and the children who are being abused right now in isolated communities that we choose not to investigate, then leave a comment below. Tell us what you think should be done differently. Tell us where the line is between religious freedom and criminal abuse. These aren't rhetorical questions. There are still communities in America that practice forms of isolation, arranged marriage, and child abuse, hiding behind claims of religious freedom. The sanctuary of the Eternal Bloodline ended, but others continue. The children with those distinctive green eyes grew up and survived, but other children in other compounds are living through similar horrors right now. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel for more hidden histories that reveal uncomfortable truths about America. And remember, the most dangerous monsters aren't the ones in stories. They're the ones we allow to exist in plain sight because confronting them would be uncomfortable, because intervening would be complicated, because it's easier to look away than to acknowledge that these horrors are happening in our country, in our time, to children who have no voice and no escape except for our willingness to see them and act.